So how am I going to make this interesting? Okay, may the odds be ever in my favor. So let's start here. This is a composite image of the Earth at night taken by a NASA satellite. Does it make a difference if I stand here or if I stand here? Okay. And essentially those pale dots that you're seeing are light emitting from the surface of the planet. It's showing us the human footprint on the planet. It's basically telling us, hey, we're expanding. And currently we are experiencing the highest period of human expansion in human history. And it's often being termed as the century of the city. And we all know that this brings with it numerous challenges. We know that we're currently very close to exceeding many of our planetary boundaries, like biodiversity loss, for example. And we're going further and further away from a safe operating space for humanity. But, you know, this is a lot of doom and gloom. And I don't like my presentations to be doom and gloom. But the other thing is that cities, because they concentrate human minds, and human minds can be pretty amazing and highly imaginative. And when we put our minds to it, we can be quite innovative. So cities are often the centers of innovation. And today, I'm going to tell you a story of one innovative thing, and that's the story of the Durban Metropolitan Open Space System, which you've heard about in Richard's presentation and Lao's presentation before that. But, so I'm not going to go into the detail, you can read that, and obviously you remember everything everyone said already about Dimas. But just to tell you that it's over 30 years old, the system, which is quite a huge feat for an African city in the global south, a city like all African cities, Durban, experiencing numerous challenges, social challenges, environmental challenges, economic and governance challenges. So how is it that over the period of 30 years, the system has been able to not only be relevant, but I would say even be a success? There are obviously challenges, but how did we get to this? How did we get to where we are today? What are the driving forces of that? So we asked ourselves that question because we wanted to know what have been the factors that have driven the success. I'm going to use success, but we can talk about that later. The success of Dimas, and if we had to go forward, how do we replicate this? How do other cities replicate it if they want to create such an open space system? So Alex Marsh spoke about an overlay, creating an overlay now, a biodiversity overlay, and this is exactly what Dimas is. And considering that it's 30 years old, I think that's pretty innovative. So what we did was we interviewed a number of people who were involved in the development of Dimas. Then we scoured the literature, basically Dimas policy documents, and we had a whole bunch of qualitative data. And because we had no idea how to analyze it, we enlisted a social scientist who told us about this methodology called discourse analysis. What? Okay, we'll talk about that just now. But essentially what we wanted to do was essentially use the discourse analysis approach to gain insight into the conceptual thinking and thematic factors that have contributed to the establishment of Dimas and the co-evolution of social, political, and biodiversity planning processes. And we produced a number of pretty graphs and lots of horrendograms and other diagrams. But because I'm not a student, I don't think I really have to stand here today and talk to you about all of my analytical methods. What I'd like to do is tell you a story about how we got from the 1989 Dimas, 30 years on, to about the 2016 or 2017 Dimas, and leave out all of the jargon. But first, some jargon. So what is discourse analysis? So it's essentially studying how language affects our interpretation of the world, our social practices, and our systems of thought. So it affects how we think. So in a nutshell, it's an analysis of how the language we use gives meaning to the world, affects our interpretations, social practices, and systems of thought. So how has the language and vocabulary surrounding Dimas made it continue to be effective and relevant for 30 years? And I thought, how do I give you an example? And I had like 20 slides of examples, but then I would be talking forever. So I thought about just this one. So if we had to look at the word terrorist, it connotes quite negatively. But if we had, depends on our, okay, so one person, we call this person a terrorist. But if we had to call the person a freedom fighter, the same person, the connotation is fundamentally different. Also, our historical backgrounds and our cultural practices will determine the words that we use and also how we see these things. So essentially, my point is, words are quite important. Words give meaning to the world. And this talk and the story that follows, and all of the slides that follow, is about how that happens. So in discourse analysis terminology, it's called policy vocabularies, or the words and the ideas and practices that give meaning to our world. But obviously, these do not occur in a vacuum. People use the words, the ideas, and the practices. And in discourse analysis terminology, these are your policy entrepreneurs. So these are your experts or your strategists, people in positions of power, or just us, and how we actually use policy vocabularies, how we talk about ideas to entrench them into the minds of people. But where we find discourses and ideas becoming most successful is if you have a window of opportunity. So these are basically times or periods that make people more receptive to hearing what we want to say. So for example, a window of opportunity or policy window may be things like political change or upheaval. It could also be things like someone publishing a paper, and in the paper you start talking about things like biodiversity or whatever, and this becoming part of the common lexicon. It could even be things as simple as writing a journal article or writing an article in a newspaper. And I had another example, but it completely slips my mind. But when these three things come together, policy vocabularies, policy entrepreneurs, the people, and during these times of opportunity or windows of opportunity, what you end up with is an entrenchment of an idea in a mindset, in a society's mindset or in an institution. And this is just basically termed institutionalization. So how has Dimas been institutionalized within Durban over the 30 years? So the story starts just before the 1980s. And what you had, our policy window at the time, was burgeoning industrial and commercial development. So people, and actually you'll be surprised to know it was actually individuals. So an individual in the Wildlife Society, Keith Cooper, I'm not sure if you know, he and maybe a few of his buddies realized that, we're losing our natural resources. And this was the case throughout the province of Natal, and decided that we need to be able to put lines on maps to show where these areas are and protect them so that we don't end up in basically a society in which we don't even know what a tree is. And together with the Natal Town and Regional Planning Commission, they actually created the first MOS. It wasn't called DMOS then because it was more for the Greater Durban area and not for the city of Durban. And it was called the Metropolitan Open Space System in 1979. And the MOS at that time was largely focused on words like, so your policy vocabularies was conservation, vegetation mapping, ecology, and conservation of individual species. So it's very conservation-centric. I just want to, before I move off the slide, so the Natal Town and Regional Planning Commission were fundamental to actually setting the scene for why we currently have a successful DMOS. And that was actually such a weird bunch of people. They don't exist anymore, but they were planners, but they were so passionate about the environment. So you may know, maybe familiar with Beg's Estuaries of Natal. They funded that research. Another research project on the ecology of vegetation in the Tugela River Basin. It was amazing the types of studies that this planning organization funded. So they were fundamental to this. So the scene was set for MOS. Then you had the 1980s to the 1990s, and oftentimes, and through our research, we found that this tended to be sort of almost a golden period of opportunity for tabling environmental issues. Why that is, I can't tell you. One councillor suggested in an interview that people had a sense that impending political change was happening. So people at the time wanted to get all their ideas in so they could leave a legacy behind, a legacy of conservation, certain conservation-minded people. So these are the various coincidences you had at the time. You had people at the university, an academic at the time, looking at Durban and realizing that his frog species were disappearing. So Pickersgill reed frog, actually. You had councillors within the municipality thinking about environmental resources and losing them and potentially actually protecting them. You had a planning department in the city of Durban at the time who was interested in a book put out by Ian McCall called Design with Nature, and they were looking at using the natural environment to attenuate stormwater. So the word ecosystem services wasn't around then, but this is already starting to think around ecosystem service vocabularies. And all of these various people, together with the Wildlife Society, started talking to each other. And what you ended up getting then was the first ever Durban Metropolitan Open Space System being adopted by the Durban City Council. So it was a long process, how that happened. There were many individuals and many very passionate individuals, but ultimately in 1989 you had your first Dimas, and the words of the policy vocabulary at the time was also very much conservation-centric. It was around the creation of nature reserves and trails, river protection, recreation, aesthetics, and linking engineering and stormwater and the environment for stormwater and attenuation. And very importantly, at the same time, another key moment of institutionalization was the creation of an environmental management branch consisting of one person in the city of Durban. So for the city of Durban in 1989, that was a first, and that was Dr. Deborah Roberts. So in the years following the creation of the first Dimas, you had political upheaval, political change that threatened to undermine the plan. So this was your 1994, South Africa just entered into democracy. And the reason for that is the fact that apartheid and all of the legislation of apartheid, while being a national policy, its impacts were powerfully local. So your new councillors and the new people that were now making decisions had a very negative perception of the environment. In fact, the word Dimas was often termed demon. It was seen as something that was taking land away. And not untruly so, because previously the natural environment was often used in the implementation of apartheid laws as buffer areas between race groups to keep people segregated. So in the department, we realized, the environmental management branch or department at the time realized that they needed to reframe Dimas. It couldn't be about conservation anymore. And just at that time, Bob Costanza put out his paper on ecosystem services, which was a hook that the department decided to use to then keep Dimas relevant, to make sure that it was something that was palatable to the councillors, the politicians, and the decision makers at the time. So Dimas was then reframed for the ecosystem services that it provided to the citizens of Durban, and here the words of like conservation were completely removed. So it was about ecosystem services, and at the same time the municipal boundary increased, and you'll see that in the image there. So you had to remap Dimas, so we increased the area of Dimas to about 45,000 hectares. And the environmental management branch grew into environmental management department, and probably now at this stage had about 4 people. At the time, we were thinking along planning tools. So how do you give Dimas more teeth? So the consultants that were employed at the time were looking at things like rate certificates and land acquisition, but they were still very much in its infancy. These ideas about society and the economy and linking it to the environment. Following this and Dimas and its name change and reframing it to be more relevant, you had a relatively stable period for Dimas. But the pressures to the environment were growing and growing and growing. And the city of Durban at the time, particularly Richard, as manager of the biodiversity planning branch of the environmental management department, wanted to move away from simply just planning. We wanted to move towards more implementation and giving Dimas more teeth. So Dimas was basically an overlay, controlled development layer. It didn't really have that much protection. What it did was inform us of land in the city that was environmentally sensitive, so we would then receive applications and then comment on these applications. But we wanted to give it more teeth, and the way we did that, and Richard already spoke about this, was incorporating Dimas into the municipal town planning schemes, which is the first for a South African city. And what this meant was that all landowners were notified and were made aware of the fact that Dimas was within the schemes as a controlled development layer. And so basically the information was out there about Dimas. It was challenged in the High Court, and then this led to a landmark milestone for Dimas, where for the first time, local government, the mandate for local government to protect the environment was supported by the High Court. And what you saw here was where local government was actually impacting what happened at a national level. And I think that was that was actually quite a mean feat for Dimas at the time. So following that, what you found is that, and this is the case to present day, is that biodiversity doesn't really have much. It's not really important, even on a global level. It's not the first thing that people talk about. It's not at the forefront of the international debates. What is climate change. So people aren't very interested in biodiversity. So the department, because we're really good at manipulating how we speak about Dimas, we decided to use this whole climate change as a hook to make people, to garner further interest in Dimas. And at the time, the policy window just happened to be that Durban was a host city for the Soccer World Cup. So how do we go about using this policy window as policy entrepreneurs? And largely at this time, a lot of the other policy entrepreneurs which started Dimas had fallen away. So you basically had the staff and management within the environmental management department tinkering away and thinking about how we were going to keep Dimas relevant using climate change. And through the Soccer World Cup, we committed to offsetting Durban's carbon footprint using ecosystem-based adaptation. So we said, okay, we'll host the World Cup. Here's a platform to, one, increase knowledge about climate change because the whole world is looking at us, but also offset the World Cup, use and promote Dimas. So you would have heard about projects like the Buffalo's Dry Reforestation Project, so planting lots and lots of trees, recreating habitat, and making people aware, but also fundamentally promoting projects which facilitated the creation of jobs and the upliftment of communities. So once again, looking at the green economy and bringing together society and economy and the environment. So Dimas was institutionalized here through the creation of a restoration ecology branch. So we got a lot more funding from our treasury because with the National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, cities were meant, all landowners were meant to ensure that they kept their land free of invasive alien species. And the Environmental Management Department changed its name from to the Environmental Planning and Climate Protection Department, basically showing that effectively increasing our mandates. And the staff complement at this stage, if you remember I told you it started with one individual, at this stage was probably around 30 staff members. Okay, so currently where we are is, so systematic conservation planning is a conservation standard worldwide. We've latched onto that policy window, and we've got a team of really good ecologists within the biodiversity planning branch who use who have developed our own systematic conservation assessments. So Dimas has been refined and approved by Council again in 2016. And very, very interestingly, and probably one of the best milestone institutionalizations is when people who used to previously fight with us about why we want to have this layer in our town planning schemes are now our advocates. So we've got our framework planning team actually telling other individuals why Dimas is important. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so this is basically just showing how the policy vocabulary of Dimas has changed, just to make sure that it was relevant. So it's added things on, it's transformed, it's recombined, and it has evolved. And you went from conservation to ecosystem, to systems thinking, to adding on ecosystem services, thereafter from moving from planning to implementation, and now using climate change and restoration ecology as our hook. So this is one of those ugly graphs, but one of the things I just want to bring your attention to is that throughout the history of Dimas, one of the key things that has remained relatively constant while other things have basically decreased in importance and increased in importance is ecology. So the fundamental, so Dimas is basically underpinned by really good science and ecology is critical to our layer. That's basically just showing that planning also is quite important, but that's because the department is within a planning unit. So we are able to influence planning in that way. One of the interesting things out of the research was that when you started the development of Dimas, you had numerous policy entrepreneurs, politicians were in NGOs, academics, and as Dimas, as you moved along the development of Dimas, it basically just became the Environmental Planning and Climate Protection Department. But what we're doing now is we realize that we cannot protect those 80,000 some odd hectares of Dimas by ourselves. So we're increasing those policy entrepreneurs again and creating partnerships like with the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So we're bringing in academia once again. We're creating partnerships with conservancies and NGOs because we cannot manage all of the land by ourselves or protect it or enforce it. And also ensuring that we maintain critical links with our international, national, and provincial partners. Where to from here? And Richard's already touched on a lot of this, but using other hooks. So we know that we need to get into our traditional authority areas. We're using hooks like this. For the first time ever, the United Nations has an urban sustainable development goal. So we're definitely going to be using these wording when we go to our politicians to tell them why Dimas is important. We're looking at urban resilience, especially in light of things like the most recent storm event that we had, ensuring that we can use whatever's happening around us to promote environmental protection, biodiversity protection. Richard spoke about financial mechanisms and basically just ensuring that we keep it relevant. So these are basically all of the various things that are going to be added to Dimas to make sure that it keeps transforming and it keeps evolving, and hopefully 30 years from now it's still pretty much intact. Thank you.